Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update. And as we continue to deliberate the latest developments from Israel and the region, it's always important to remember that 132 days ago, the Islamist terror groups from the Hamas-plagued Gaza Strip launched an onslaught on southern Israel, declaring war by perpetrating a massacre, murdering some 1,200 mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping 246 people, including elderly, women, men, children, and infants. 134 of them remain in captivity to date. Let's now turn to our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. What can you update us on with the latest?
So several key points. The IDF has announced that last night it managed to kill in an airstrike a key official of the Radwan force, the Hezbollah commando force in southern Lebanon. It happened in the town of Nabatea, and along with him was one of his associates and another Radwan fighter. And you can add to that an announcement by Defense Minister Yoav Gallant that indeed there is an escalation in the exchange between Hezbollah and Israel. However, this escalation is only within one step in a 10-step ladder. So this was intended to both reassure the population in northern Israel that the IDF is taking care of the threats, but also that there is no intention right now, at least not on Israel's part, to go to a full-blown war. In addition to that, there was a national level exercise which, according to the scenario, played the multi-front war, which Israel is almost entering, could result in long periods of darkness. If power stations are being hit, the population will have to get by with fewer staples. And many authorities, both national and local, took part in this exercise in order to prepare for the eventuality, which last year sounded merely theoretical, but now is unfortunately getting quite practical. Now, getting south to Gaza, two developments. One is that the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis was the location of a special operation by the IDF, mostly intended to get the bodies of hostages who were kept there in the medical compound, some of whom were killed after they were abducted and were taken into Gaza, and some bodies were probably taken from Israel, having been killed on the spot. The last point to be made is that the Biden administration has overnight made an extraordinary statement. And the State Department spokesperson, as well as others, this is obviously coordinated throughout the administration. The spokesperson said that the hostage deal, which will include a ceasefire and humanitarian assistance to the population in Gaza, is a national security interest of the United States. This is quite an announcement, and this is indicating that if the Israeli government, rather than Hamas, tries to torpedo such a deal, it will be held accountable for hurting an American national security interest.
Of course, when the Biden administration talks about this, it takes into account the fact that a number of the Israeli hostages in Hamas captivity happen to be dual nationals, which of course provides them that foundation to act on that. Nevertheless, there are quite the political stains in such a statement of trying to hold the Israeli government accountable. I'm not sure that there is love between the current government in Jerusalem to that of the United States and Washington. Nevertheless, they do have a number of strategic interests aligned with one another that both sides try to keep to. But let's now turn to the Israeli commander of the Israeli Air Force Task Force for Air and Missile Defense, namely Brigadier General in Reserve Doron Gavish. It's good to see you, General. I'd like to ask you about yesterday, cross-border attack that emanated from Lebanon when Hezbollah launched a number of rockets towards the northern town of Tzfat or Safed. What can you tell us about that, and what went wrong, considering the fact that the Iron Dome did not intercept projectiles that usually are quite the easy projectiles to contend with?
Jonathan, we talked about it so many times that indeed the Iron Dome is a very effective system, probably the most effective system in the world, but still it is not 100%. There is no hermetic defense. Therefore, we always ask our civilians to listen to those orders that are being issued by the Home Front Command and to go to the shelters accordingly. So nothing, surprising from a professional point of view. Unfortunately, this is something that could happen. Out of 10, there might be one that would penetrate the defense, and this is again why we have this combination between the passive defense and the active defense. The other thing which is important to say is that the Hezbollah, although something like what we saw yesterday happened, but they didn't aim toward the city in the northern part of Israel. They were aiming toward the military installations, and this again put us in the framework of, let's put it this way, understandings that there are in both ways, that what are the exactly rules of this cruel game between Israel and the Hezbollah. How do we still keep ourselves under the threshold of full-scale war? And this is part of it, while the Hezbollah intentionally is to shoot toward military installation in the northern part of Israel and not civilian cities, although this was what we've seen yesterday. There was the announcement by the Minister of Defense that Amir referred to it before. And of course, we saw also that today there was a high leader in the Radwan forces, which is the operational forces on the Hezbollah, that was, let's say it went back to heaven. I'm not sure to heaven, but he is not alive anymore. And this was an operation that was carried out quite deep into the Lebanese Hezbollah area. So it is what we continuously seeing during the last few months. I don't think that there is something very different from it, although, as we said, at least the announcement was saying that the IDF is going up another step in the ladder.
Thank you, General Gavish. I'd like now to turn to retired Colonel Mr. Joel Rayburn, formerly a senior director at the National Security Council in Washington and U.S. Special Envoy for Syria. It's good to see you, Colonel. I'd like to ask you particularly about a couple of statements. The first coming out of Yemen, where we hear the information minister of the designated terrorist organization Ansar Allah, namely the Houthi-dominated organization, declare that they have recruited some 200,000 volunteers to prepare to go to war against Israel, and within that context also highlighted that they're warning the United States that until now they didn't really deliberately conduct too much of a scaled effort to block maritime shipping in the Red Sea. Nevertheless, now they will do so if the Biden administration decides to enforce the sanctions against Ansar Allah. And that, of course, aligns with other statements coming out from other Iranian proxies in the region. What can you tell us about that? And what is the American approach currently to contend with the rising threat that is not only threatening Israel or the United States, but also allies and partners in the region and maritime shipping at large?
Well, the Houthis themselves are not relevant to the crisis that's going on. These decisions are made in Tehran by the Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guard's leadership. And so the decision of whether to continue these kinds of attacks, really what is a maritime offensive against Western shipping, the reason it's going on is because the Iranians are not deterred from continuing it. I think you don't have to pay any attention at all to Houthi rhetoric. I mean, it's pretty outlandish. There aren't 200,000 of them to begin with, and even if they did form some sort of force, they have a couple of other countries that they would have to walk through or drive through somehow in order to reach Israel. And that's the kind of offensive that Israel should want to have to deal with. Is tens of thousands of Houthis crossing the desert without any air force or air defense. So you can put that kind of rhetoric aside. What seems to be clear, though, is that the Iranians have decided to continue this threat in the Red Sea and to escalate continue their offensive in the Bab el-Mandeb. This contrasts, I think, with what we're seeing across Iraq and eastern Syria, where since the U.S. side took the significant strikes against Kataib Hezbollah leadership earlier this month, that those sort of attacks have dropped off to almost nothing. That indicates, I think, that the Iranians made a decision to not threaten a further escalatory cycle with the U.S. in the north while continuing it in the south. And I think that means that the response that you've seen so far is not sufficient for them to decide that there's a heavy price to be paid. In addition, not just to the military steps, but because there hasn't been a restarting, I think, of the financial pressure which is available to the U.S. against the axis of resistance. In that regard, let me just tack on to this quick discussion that the U.S. Congress yesterday, I think, showed a significant step by having the House of Representatives pass the bill to assign sanctions to normalization efforts with the Assad regime. This has to pass the Senate, but if this becomes law, and if it doesn't become law in 2024, there's certainly a signal that it would in 2025 if there's a change of hands in Congress. Then that would be a significant escalation in non-military pressure against the axis of resistance, centering on the Assad regime, which is a place where the Iranian regime and its allies are very vulnerable.
Absolutely. The Caesar Act 2.0, so to speak,
right,
will also degrade to a certain degree the capacity of the Assad regime to further integrate into the Arab League, which is quite significant. But I'd like now to turn also to Central Israel, where we're joined by retired Colonel Dr. Eran Lerman, who formerly served as the Deputy National Security Council Director here in Israel, and is currently also the Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and the Editor-in-Chief of the Jerusalem Jerusalem Strategic Tribune, among others. We'll keep it at that. Of course, also the host of TV7's Middle East Review that will air later this month. It's good to see you, Colonel. I'd like to ask you particularly about Israel's activities within the framework of U.S. strategy. How can the State of Israel contend with so many various elements of threats that are posing tangible threats to not only Israeli sovereignty and security of Israeli citizens, but beyond that, to national security interests throughout the region and beyond?
Well, I think at the military level, at the level of military cooperation, intelligence sharing, the broader strategic perspective, there is still a solid base of commonality, which is also reflected in the relationship that has been built, particularly in recent years, with the U.S. Military High Command and quite specifically with Central Command bearing in mind that Israel moved into the CENTCOM AOR over the last 2 years and became the most significant military partner. This, I think, is still relevant to the situation as it unfolds in the face of various provocations by Iran's plethora of proxies, which at the end of the day are aiming at Israel, but they are aiming much higher. They are part of a broader coalition of international forces seeking to undo the American position in international affairs. All of this still makes for commonalities. At the same time, it's hard to ignore, and Amir has already mentioned it, the growing tension between the present government in Israel and the Biden administration, particularly its other wing, its diplomatic wing, when it comes to national security policy, over matters essentially, at the end of the day, pertaining not only to the hostage situation, but to the question of the day after. What is Israel seeking to see emerging in Gaza? The related question of a potential ceasefire, the related question of our planned offensive in the last remaining strongholds of Hamas in the southern edge of the Gaza Strip, namely the area of Rafah and along the Egyptian border. All of these have generated a growing sense of tension, and unfortunately, it is my impression that the latest conversation between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden, which of course was a significant thing in itself after a short period of nearly, let's say, disconnect, nevertheless did not go well enough to bridge over these growing differences, and hence the I would say strategically placed leaks coming out of Washington on ideas such as unilateral American recognition of a Palestinian state. I don't think the British Secretary of Foreign Affairs would have ventured to raise such suggestions without some degree of coordination with Blinken's State Department. But all of this is still in the realm of mutual pressures. Whether it actually makes sense to recognize the extremely dysfunctional pseudo-government in Ramallah as a sovereign state under present circumstances, whether this will actually guarantee a better life for the Palestinians or a solution to the conflict is an extremely doubtful proposition. So I would hope that we are still in the game of thrusts and counter thrusts, and not sliding into a fixed policy which cannot work. The horse must be hitched ahead of the cart and not the other way around. The Iranian challenge is the horse. If dealt with effectively, the region can change. If it is made to be dependent upon the fantasy of a functional Palestinian state in the near future, then somebody some people have been getting their priorities all wrong.
Thank you, Colonel Lerman. I'd like to turn to Mr. Oren and ask you particularly, I saw that there were a number of Israeli hostages, released hostages that traveled to Den Haag or the Hague in the Netherlands, where they were joined also by families of hostages currently in captivity, and a number of also support circles to protest the ICC in order to investigate Hamas and to conduct it in a fashion that would establish maybe potentially a glimmer of hope to once again see their loved ones return back home. What can you tell us about that? Obviously, the negotiations are currently in a certain deadlock because of Hamas's obscene demands and, of course, also in Jerusalem, their efforts to play the game of negotiations. Where are things heading from here?
So the hostages in Holland, or the hostage families in Holland, is an exercise in futility. Obviously, Hamas is not a member state of the United Nations and therefore not of the ICJ. It's good for television coverage. It's good for some public pressure, but this would probably not move the judges in the ICJ, who in about 10 days or so are supposed to get an interim report a month after they issued their initial opinion on the South African complaint against Israel. So it has a very limited value, and Qatar, Egypt, United States, that is the mediators, and of course Hamas itself are not going to be moved by it. It was not in vain, but one should not expect too much out of it. Now, we have a closing window as the race towards Ramadan, March 10, is getting full speed ahead. And one of the problems which we have not mentioned yet, and that some ministers in the cabinet have been warning about, is what is coming in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, regarding several phenomena. First of all, the fact that Palestinian workers can only work now in the settlements or in certain industrial parks in the Palestinian territory, because some Israeli ministers veto giving them permits to work in Israel proper. This, of course, adds to unemployment, resentment, and it's very explosive. Also, the money which Israel has collected in tax revenues for the Palestinian Authority, but is again being blocked for various reasons, some of them justified, some of them merely political. And if during Ramadan, some of the more extreme elements in Israel provoke East Jerusalemites and residents of the West Bank, the intelligence organizations, both military and civilian, are warning that this could explode. The situation is very delicate as it is, and this, while up to now, for almost 5 months, the West Bank and East Jerusalem stayed out of the Israel-Hamas conflict. This could add a third front, or a fourth front if you include Yemen, and perhaps even the most sensitive one.
We don't have very much time left, and therefore I'd like to ask each of you to maintain up to 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes tops. General Kavish, we saw IDF Chief of General Staff Herzi Halevi, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, tour the northern front, communicate also with local council heads and a number of reservists, during the course of which he said, prepare for a northern war. What are we to make from such a statement?
Well, you're right, Jonathan. This is exactly what was said by the Chief of Staff General Herzi Halevi. And, Israel is preparing itself to all the options. One of the options, of course, is the military option, and this is exactly what is being meant by General Halevi. We have to say that Israel is in a very high preparedness toward the northern part of Israel. We say it again and again, mainly with his Air Force, and we're talking about minutes. If we would have to retaliate if something would occur from the northern arena. But I think it is strategically signaling that this option is on the table. Israel is prepared to it, and if this would be the decision, Israel would be able to carry it out. The last thing that I would just mention, going back to the south, we have to remember that Israel is still very occupied with the Khan Yunis area. The special forces are there. We saw 2 days ago the release of the hostages, but the I would say the fight is still going on. We saw a short video released of Sinwar itself and his family in the caves over there in the tunnels, and there was a reaction to it also by the Palestinians that lives there.
Indeed. Colonel Rayburn, I'd like to ask you particularly about a statement made by IAEA Director General Rafael Mariano Grossi, who highlighted just yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, at a conference here in the Middle East, that the Iranians are currently in a stage that is very similar to that of North Korea at the early 2000s. And he was referring, of course, to the transition from a claimed non-nuclear state to a nuclear-armed state. Are we expected to see a certain breakthrough at some point?
Well, it's a very dangerous window that we're in, because what you would need in order to forestall that, and I have no doubt that the Iranian regime leadership has to be looking at the situation and calculating whether now is a moment to get right up to the line or perhaps over it in terms of a nuclear capability, as well as the other aspects that you have to have in order to weaponize nuclear capability. And they have to be sizing up the U.S.'s approach to the region right now. The U.S. is paralyzed. The U.S. administration is paralyzed on the question of the broader problem of the Iranian regime, and wanting to focus solely on the Gaza crisis, I think, to the exclusion of all else, as though everything else is truly a corollary, as though to grant credibility to the Iranian rhetoric that all their moves are simply in response to Israeli provocations or Israeli war crimes or whatever they would term it, and so on. And that's demonstrated, I think, by the fact that the Biden administration got so embroiled in just the local question and its implications for the U.S. election season that they actually sent their Deputy National Security Advisor, John Feiner, and Samantha Power to Michigan. So in other words, national security and foreign policy leaders to Michigan to engage the local community there to try to get to work on their disapproval among Muslim American voters. This is something extraordinary at a time when there's just no coherent response to the Iranian regime's deliberate strategy of provoking across the region. So yeah, we're in a very dangerous time, and the nuclear question is part of that.
Indeed. Dr. Lerman, I'd like to ask you briefly, if I may, about the visit by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan to Egypt, where he met with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. The senior advisor of President Erdogan, namely his interpreter and Middle East advisor, called also during this trip for the destruction of Israel and to prepare the Muslim Ummah to move forward on this aspiration. What should we read out of that? Is that detached from the other rhetoric coming out of Ankara as well?
Well, of course, Erdogan swore in previous years he would never shake Sisi's hand. He's done so now in order to basically break down the barriers that have been built between him and important elements in the Arab world. I don't think the Egyptians are going to be tempted. They've been making it very clear, including statements from Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry, that the peace with Israel is important to Egypt and Egypt's future, and it will be sustained, and the way can be found for Israel and Egypt to come to understandings about the management of the situation in southern Gaza, as long as Israel ensures that the Palestinians will not be pushed over the border, and some Israelis who've been making extremist statements should be basically restrained. The Turkish position, or the flourishes of hate that come from time to time from Erdogan are not new to us. We've seen this when he inaugurated the Hagia Sophia once again as a mosque and said, well, and Al-Aqsa may come next, etc. There is a streak of deep hatred and a neo-Ottoman fantasy in his policies that then again and again comes up against reality. And I think this would happen again. The Egyptians may wish to see the level of hostility with Turkey reduced, but they will not be, I believe, drawn over the line into that kind of position that have given Egypt so much grief in the 20th century, and has the peace, whereas the peace has given them a very different trajectory since 1979.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Dr. Lehrman, Colonel Rayburn, General Gavish, and Mr. Owen for taking out of your times to update us on the latest. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next update from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.
My name is Lehrman. I used to be Deputy National Security Advisor to the Government of Israel, currently Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, a think tank, and the editor of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune. For the last few years, I've been a regular panelist for TV7, a fantastic opportunity to bring deep and analytical perspectives to the debate over regional affairs, Israeli affairs, international affairs, in the company of some of the best minds in Israel.